In the volatile landscape of Middle Eastern geopolitics, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has long been a contentious and deeply rooted issue. Recent events in Gaza, Palestine, have once again ignited tensions, drawing international attention and condemnation. The conflict, which has been ongoing for decades, often flares up into violence with devastating consequences for both sides. In the wake of these latest clashes, two major players on the global stage, China and Saudi Arabia, have taken the extraordinary step of imposing sanctions on Israel and the United States. This move has sent shockwaves through the international community and has significant implications for the future of the region and global politics. To understand the significance of the sanctions imposed by China and Saudi Arabia, it is essential to first grasp the complex and deeply entrenched Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The root of the conflict lies in the historical dispute over territory, with both Israelis and Palestinians laying claim to the land of Israel. The establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 and the subsequent displacement of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been central issues that continue to fuel the conflict. China's involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been relatively low-key in the past. Historically, China maintained diplomatic relations with both Israel and Palestine while advocating for a peaceful two-state solution. However, China's stance has shifted in recent years, particularly under President Xi Jinping's leadership. One factor driving China's increased engagement in the Middle East is its growing energy dependence on the region. China is the world's largest importer of crude oil, and a significant portion of its oil imports come from the Middle East, including Saudi Arabia and Iran. This reliance on the region's energy resources has compelled China to seek a more active role in Middle Eastern affairs, including the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In the aftermath of the recent events in Gaza, China took the unprecedented step of imposing sanctions on Israel and the United States. These sanctions represent a significant departure from China's previous approach of advocating for peaceful negotiations between the Israelis and Palestinians. The move has been met with mixed reactions from the international community. China's sanctions on Israel primarily target arms sales and military cooperation. China has suspended all military exports to Israel and terminated existing defense contracts. Additionally, China has called on other nations to follow suit and join in condemning Israeli actions in Gaza. The sanctions on the United States are more symbolic in nature, given the strong historical ties between the two countries. China has expressed its disapproval of the U.S.'s unwavering support for Israel and its use of its veto power in the United Nations Security Council to block resolutions critical of Israel. While the sanctions on the U.S. do not have a substantial economic impact, they serve as a clear message that China is willing to challenge American influence in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, a key regional player in the Middle East, has also taken the extraordinary step of imposing sanctions on Israel and the United States. This move is especially significant given Saudi Arabia's historical reluctance to openly confront Israel and its decades-long partnership with the United States. The Saudi sanctions on Israel include a suspension of diplomatic relations and a freeze on trade and investment ties. Saudi Arabia has also called for a summit of Arab and Muslim nations to discuss a unified response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This marks a departure from Saudi Arabia's previous diplomatic efforts to maintain open channels of communication with Israel while pursuing regional stability. The Saudi sanctions on the United States target arms sales and military support. Saudi Arabia, like China, has expressed frustration with the U.S.'s unwavering support for Israel and its role in perpetuating the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The Saudi government's decision to sanction its longtime ally underscores the severity of the situation and the shifting dynamics in the Middle East. The imposition of sanctions by China and Saudi Arabia carries significant implications for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the broader geopolitical landscape. China and Saudi Arabia's sanctions increase international pressure on Israel to re-evaluate its policies towards the Palestinians. While Israel has traditionally relied on strong backing from the United States, these sanctions signal a potential shift in global sentiment, making it more challenging for Israel to justify its actions in Gaza. The sanctions imposed by China and Saudi Arabia challenge the United States' dominant role in the Middle East. As two major players in the region, their actions indicate a willingness to assert their influence and challenge American hegemony, potentially reshaping the geopolitical landscape in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia's call for a summit of Arab and Muslim nations to discuss the Israeli-Palestinian conflict signals a potential shift towards collective diplomacy in the region. This could pave the way for a more unified stance among Arab and Muslim nations, increasing their leverage in addressing the conflict. China's sanctions on Israel and the U.S. may impact energy dynamics in the Middle East. While China is a significant consumer of Middle Eastern oil, it now appears willing to take a more assertive stance on political matters, potentially complicating its relationships with oil-producing nations in the region. The involvement of China and Saudi Arabia in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict highlights the evolving nature of global diplomacy. As major players on the world stage, their actions demonstrate a willingness to challenge the status quo and take more active roles in addressing international crises. While the sanctions imposed by China and Saudi Arabia represent a significant development in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, they also carry certain challenges and risks. Israel and the United States may perceive these sanctions as diplomatic isolation and become less receptive to negotiations or international pressure. This could further entrench their positions and hinder efforts for a peaceful resolution. The imposition of sanctions by Saudi Arabia, in particular, could contribute to regional instability. The Middle East is already fraught with tensions and conflicts, and Saudi Arabia's involvement in the Israeli-Palestinian issue may exacerbate existing rivalries and conflicts. While the sanctions' economic impact on Israel and the U.S. may be limited, they could potentially have broader economic consequences if they escalate into trade disputes or other forms of economic retaliation. The unpredictability of China's and Saudi Arabia's actions in the future introduces a level of uncertainty into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the broader Middle East. It is unclear how these nations will continue to navigate their roles and relationships in the region. The repercussions of China and Saudi Arabia's sanctions on Israel and the United States extend beyond the immediate crisis in Gaza and have broader implications for the Middle East and global politics. One of the key questions that arises from these sanctions is how they will affect the ongoing peace process in the region. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict has seen numerous attempts at negotiation and peace talks over the years, with varying degrees of success. The involvement of China and Saudi Arabia, both of which have significant influence in the region, could either bolster or hinder these efforts. On one hand, the sanctions may pressure Israel and the U.S. to reconsider their positions and engage more constructively in peace negotiations. The international community, including China and Saudi Arabia, has long supported a two-state solution, and their sanctions may be seen as a means to push the parties toward this goal. However, on the other hand, the sanctions could also lead to a hardening of positions, particularly if Israel and the U.S. perceive themselves as being unfairly targeted. This could make it even more challenging to find common ground for a lasting peace. Another aspect to consider is the impact of these sanctions on the Palestinian people themselves. While the sanctions are primarily aimed at Israel and the U.S., they could indirectly affect the Palestinian territories. Economic repercussions, disruptions in humanitarian aid, or changes in diplomatic dynamics could all have consequences for the Palestinian population, who are already suffering from years of conflict and political instability. Furthermore, the role of China and Saudi Arabia in the Middle East is evolving rapidly. China's growing economic presence in the region, driven by its Belt and Road Initiative, has made it an increasingly influential player. Its willingness to take a more assertive stance in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict demonstrates its ambitions to shape the geopolitical landscape. Saudi Arabia, traditionally a staunch ally of the United States, is also recalibrating its approach to regional diplomacy. These shifts could have far-reaching consequences for U.S. foreign policy and the balance of power in the Middle East. The imposition of sanctions on Israel and the United States by China and Saudi Arabia in response to the recent events in Gaza, Palestine, represents a significant shift in the dynamics of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the broader Middle East.